And let's start share screen. So as Mr. Betts highlighted, it's manifest destiny that will bring about America's ultimate test, as he says at the end of his song, that ultimate test. Again, as we talked about Western expansion, will that, as states come into the Union, or are they going to be slave, or are they going to be free? It's really control of the West that ultimately will bring the ultimate division between North and South. But we're going to have to wait till Thursday for that. We've seen that already with the Missouri Compromise as a debate over the expansion of slavery. What we need to talk about today is some of the other triggers dividing Northerners and Southerners. I think where we left off, we ended with talking about the Missouri Compromise and how that theoretically settled the expansion of slavery question by drawing this imaginary 3630 line. Right above that line, in the future, no slavery. Below that line, maybe slavery. Theoretically, the slavery question was settled. Our politicians thought, okay, we're done with that. That question is settled. But as we kind of left off, the rise of an abolition movement in the North, Nat Turner's rebellion in the South, which brought on a much harsher form of slave discipline, meant that the slavery question was not going away. The slavery question was going to become more central to divisions between North and the South in the future. However, the next great crisis of the Union really didn't involve the expansion of slavery. In some ways, it didn't even involve slavery in any direct kind of way. The next great crisis of the Union, possibly even more consequential than even the Missouri Compromise fight, was the so-called nullification crisis. The nullification crisis between 1828 and 1832. All this stuff we're talking about is all textbook stuff. So if the lecture stuff doesn't seem clear to you, you can always go and review this in McClay's book. Nullification crisis between 1828 and 1832, pitting the good people of South Carolina against the federal government. South Carolinians, like many Southerners, were upset with what they called the tariff of abominations. The tariff of abominations. What is a tariff? Help me out. What is a tariff? It's a tax. What kind of tax is a tariff? It's a tax on imports. So foreign goods coming into the country, it's a tax on them. Southerners didn't like the tariff because the tariff was very high. Why do countries adopt a high tariff? What are they trying to do? Yeah, high tariffs are about protectionism. It's an economic philosophy of protectionism, right? You want people to buy your goods, so you artificially raise the prices of foreign goods. Now, the United States embraced a high tariff in the early years of the 1800s, mainly to benefit a particular industry in the North, textile. In Lowell, Massachusetts, people invested in a textile industry, making clothing. But they had a problem. England had a textile industry for already about 50, 60 years before that. Americans had a long tradition of buying English-made goods. So how could these American manufacturers of textiles possibly compete with foreign, particularly British producers of textiles? Tariff. A high tariff on British textiles, on British clothing, meant that more Americans would turn to buying American, and now that they could, because there's an industry, a new industry, a young industry in the North. So the tariff of abominations, as you might imagine, benefited Northern industry, particularly benefited textile producers. Southerners didn't like it. Did the tariff hurt the South? I've never seen a kind of direct correlation that a high tariff hurt the South. Some things we could imagine. As the South is becoming more and more invested in cotton production? Who are they becoming more and more connected to in the world? England, right? Where's most Southern cotton going? Going to England. A high tariff on English goods threatened that special relationship. Potentially, I don't know that it actually was at the time, but it potentially threatened that relationship. England could just, England could say, oh, if you're going to tax our goods, we're going to stop buying your cotton, which would ruin the South. So I don't know that the tariff actually was hurting trade between the South and England, but there's always a potential that it could. The other issue is Southerners bought a lot of goods from England. This kind of makes sense. They trade their goods, trade their cotton to England, and then they turn around and they buy a lot of English-made goods. Raising the price on English goods meant Southerners were going to have to pay more for these British products. Again, I don't know that was I haven't seen evidence that was actually happening, that Southerners were being ruined by high prices on British goods, but the potential was always there. So I can theoretically see how the tariff hurt the South, but I don't know that it actually was. Here's what I think Southerners were particularly upset about. The tariff probably was, theoretically was hurting them, but probably wasn't at the time, but it wasn't benefiting them. A high tariff wasn't doing any good for Southern cotton producing states. A high tariff was a great good for Northern manufacturing states, like a Boston, like a Massachusetts. This didn't seem fair, right? This is where the inequality comes from. A high tariff benefits one region of the country, maybe hurts the South, but it certainly doesn't benefit the South. And so it doesn't really seem fair. Here's a federal policy that benefits one region at the expense of the other, or at least not to the help of the other. That doesn't seem fair. The federal government should represent all of the American people, not just one region over the other. And so Southerners complained about the tariff of abominations. And this tariff really became a symbol of, look, there were always real and imagined threats, divisions between North and South. North and South for a long time had realized that these were just different societies with different traditions, different interests. There was always something coming up. It was kind of highlighting these distinctions. In this case, it was the tariff of abominations, is highlighting, man, we really do have a division in the United States between North and South. And wouldn't it be nice to have a federal government that worked on behalf of all of the American people, not just one particular region or the other. And so Southerners complained extensively in 1928 about the tariff of abominations. It's one of the reasons that they broke with their tradition, who they've been voting for, and went with a new candidate. Remember Andrew Jackson? Yeah, Andrew Jackson in 1828 was elected for a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons Jackson was elected in 1828 is the hope that he would be able to unite the country. He would help to be able to pave over the distinctions between North and South. He would be unite or not a divide. And so one of the issues Southerners really holds is that in electing Jackson, he would either get rid of the tariff of abominations out of just a principle of sectional fairness, or at least he would modify it in some kind of. So Jackson wins the presidency. Southerners are expectant. Let's see what Jackson's going to do to settle this tariff issue, to settle this distinction between North and South. What does Jackson do in regards to the tariff? What does Congress do in regards to the tariff? Nothing. Nothing really changed, right? Jackson was elected.
with the hope that he and Congress would work towards a more equal representation of sectional interests that doesn't appear to be happening, or doesn't appear to be happening as quickly as Southerners would like. Now, in 1819, in the Missouri crisis, it was Northerners praying disunion. In the nullification crisis, it's Southerners who are ramping up the talk of disunion. And a lot of this is centered in South Carolina. South Carolina is taking the lead in beginning talks of disunion, right? The conversation had always been there in the background. Are we a union that can't be dissolved, or are we a confederacy that can? Right? And there were a lot of people who had been thinking for some time, we're a confederacy. At some point, we might have to part ways. South Carolinians at this time are saying, the time has come. It's time to part ways. The federal government is not going to work on behalf of all of the American people. It's going to work exclusively for Northern manufacturing interests at the sacrifice of Southern society. So South Carolinians begin talking of not so much leaving the Union, but they begin talking about this idea of nullification. Nullification is, you heard the phrase null and void, or like you null a check or you void a check. Well, what are you doing? You're essentially canceling it. What South Carolinians are wondering, can a state nullify a federal law? A state feels a federal law is oppressive or ruinous in some kind of way. Can a state say, can a state pass legislation saying, we're not going to follow that? We're not going to abide by that. I know that's what the federal government says, but that's not for us. We're not doing it. What's the answer to that question, by the way? Does our Constitution provide any way for states to nullify federal law? Any constitutional scholars in the room? The answer is no. I think it's Article 6 of the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause. Federal law trumps state law. Always. Well, we have a federalist system, but ultimately, now in practice, that's messy, right? Michiganders know this, right? We've legalized marijuana here in Michigan. The federal government is marijuana legal at the federal level? No, it's not. And we have all these states that have legalized marijuana. How does that work? At some point, there'll have to be a reckoning on the legality or illegality of marijuana. So, but ultimately, it will be settled on behalf of what the federal government says, because that's the way our Constitution is written. Nevertheless, South Carolinians are still wondering. And they're the first to be wondering. Actually, one of the first persons to raise this issue of nullification was none other than Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had a really interesting 1798. Because by day, he's vice president of the United States. He's charged with, supporting the Union, holding the Union together. At night, he's saying, man, the federal government passed these Alien Sedition Acts, which I think are, an infringement of free speech. Can Virginia nullify these Alien Sedition Acts? Does Virginia have to follow this federal law? Remember, Jefferson didn't write the Constitution. He wasn't there. He was in France, raping Sally Hemings. And so he's wondering, can we do this? Ultimately, his nullification notes don't go anywhere until 1828, when South Carolinians dust them off and say, maybe Jefferson was onto something here. Proud son of South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, takes up Jefferson's notes, begins writing up a legal theory of nullification, begins arguing, Calhoun's a lawyer, begins arguing or figuring out how to argue that a state, in fact, can nullify a federal law when that state deems a federal law to be somehow oppressive or unfair in some kind of way, the state has a right to do this. And so John Calhoun, a career South Carolinian politician, who takes the lead in writing up a theory of nullification. Here's the other interesting thing about John C. Calhoun. The history doesn't repeat itself, historians say, but history rhymes. There's a lot of rhyming going on in 1828. It looks a lot like 1798. Who is John C. Calhoun? He's Vice President of the United States. John Calhoun was Andrew Jackson's vice president. So by day, Calhoun is charged with holding the Union together. At night, he's sitting at his desk plotting how to dissolve the Union through nullification. You think things are tense in Washington. It's nothing quite like these years, where you literally have a president and vice president, at odds with the very office of the executive branch, so divided over the issue. And it's not really even about tariff or about taxes at this point. It is really about this fundamental question of where does political power ultimately reside in the United States? Does it reside in a central government, or does it reside in the states? John Calhoun in South Carolina are pioneering. You've heard the idea of the Civil War is about states' rights. Where does that language of states' rights come from? It comes from these years. It's during these years that discourse of states' rights begins to emerge during the nullification crisis. And it's Calhoun in South Carolina who are saying, look, we have to be concerned about, we have to protect our states' rights. They also talked about state equality as well, too, right? What we need is a federal government that respects state equality. So northern states, southern states should all be treated fairly. This tariff suggests that that's not happening. And so South Carolina has to look to protect its states' rights, and other states should look to protect theirs as well. Things come to a head in the early 1830s. One event in particular dramatized just how divided the country was. So there was a ceremony and a dinner in Washington, D.C. And all the big wigs are out there, including Jackson and Calhoun. They're all there. And the governor of South Carolina stands up to give a toast. And he praises the Union, but he also praises what he calls the sovereign states. Well, Andrew Jackson knew what this governor of South Carolina was trying to say, was trying to communicate. So Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, stands up and gives a toast. He says, the federal union, or sorry, to the federal union, it must be preserved. This talk of state sovereignty from the South Carolina governor. Jackson knew what he was trying to communicate there. Jackson wasn't having it. Jackson stands up, says, federal government, federal union, it must be preserved. The whole room is silent. A showdown over toasts. Is anyone going to challenge the president of the United States, who just laid down just threw down the gloves, right? It's time to fight. And here's the issue we're going to fight over. Federal union, it must be preserved. Calhoun said. To the union. Next to our liberty, most dear. Think about the difference between those two toasts. Federal union, it must be preserved. The union, next to our liberties, most dear. What is Calhoun trying to communicate in his toast? Next to our liberties, most dear. What's he trying to say about union? Liberty trumps union. Self-determination, freedom to direct your own life trumps union. Where would Calhoun get such a crazy idea that liberty was more important than union? Where would an American politician possibly come up with the idea that liberty was more important than union? Is there anything in America's past that Calhoun could point to say, look, liberty is more important than union? Yeah, I mean, for Calhoun, for South Carolina, for Southerners, this is the American Revolution. This is a reenactment of the American Revolution. Guys, we did this before. We settled this back in 1776. Liberty is more important than union. But Calhoun's forgetting what we said in 1787. No, union's more important than liberty. That's what the U.S. Constitution was about. It was about communicating that union, creating a more perfect union, was more important, at least more important than state self-determination. So in these toasts, the battle lines are drawn. And these are tense years. We're living in pretty tense years right now, but they're not nearly as intense as some of the years in the past. In 1831 to 1833 were tense years. South Carolina ultimately proceeds with nullification. In 1832, the state legislature of South Carolina passes a nullification bill saying South Carolina does not respect the tariff, the federal tariff. How exactly does that work? How does a state say, yeah, we know you got this federal tariff, but we're not going to follow it here in South Carolina? How does that work? How does South Carolina stay under a federal government, but say we're going to pick and choose which laws we're going to follow? How does South Carolina stay in the union under these kinds of conditions? And the answer is they don't. So South Carolina passes nullification. They also begin raising a militia. Now, there's not necessarily talk of secession or leaving the union, at least at a kind of formal political level. The South Carolina is heading down that road because nullification doesn't work. There's no constitution, there's no room for it. There's no place in the Constitution for a state to stay in the union, but pick and choose which federal laws it's going to follow. It doesn't happen. And so South Carolina realizes this, and so they nullify the tariff of abomination. They immediately begin preparing to leave the union. They're just not really saying it. What is Jackson's response? It's a military response. He begins raising a federal army. Pretty tense years, right? You got South Carolina raising its own army. You got the federal government raising an army in case South Carolina decides to go forward with separation. The Jackson is ready to call federal troops in to occupy South Carolina. Pretty crazy. Now, ultimately, South Carolina backs down. Ultimately, Jackson is able to work through Congress is able to work through a compromise tariff in 1833. So, you know, each side kind of comes to the edge. Ultimately, though, there's another compromise in 1833, compromise over the tariff. But still, what does the nullification crisis say about the United States? The only way, we've been here before, if the only way you can hold your union together, if the only way you can keep states in your union is through the threat of overwhelming military force, you don't have a very good union, do you? We've been talking about the idea of a United States at this point. It's pretty silly.
the nullification crisis, this tax, the tariff was the trigger issue. But ultimately, people recognized the larger implications. John Calhoun, writing to a friend in 1830, kind of realized this. Essentially what he's saying in his letter to his friend, this isn't really about taxes. Tax is just a symbolic issue. This is ultimately an issue of, will the South, for the foreseeable future, will the South be able to determine its own fate, determine its future? By the way, peculiar institution that he mentions there, slavery. So Calhoun recognizes kind of what's at stake. The tax issue is the one that triggered this kind of reckoning. Read through the congressional records during these years. You have words like union, confederacy, things thrown back and forth by our politicians, working through this identity crisis, right? Calhoun kind of recognized what the nullification crisis was in its larger implication. This is ultimately about, will the South be able to determine its affairs moving forward, particularly will the South be able to maintain the institution of slavery or not? So, I said that this is the event that kind of taught Southerners to talk about their differences with the North and the federal government in terms of states' rights. So when if you ever debate, and why wouldn't you debate history with family and friends and roommates, right? Why would you not have conversations about the Civil War? When you get into one of those, slavery, no, it's states' rights. Yeah, it was about states' rights, but states' rights to maintain slavery, states' rights to continue slave owning, to expand slavery, right? I mean, what rights were Southerners looking to protect ultimately when they talked about their states' rights? They were talking about the right to maintain the institution, not to maintain, but to expand the institution. So it's important to kind of complete the sentence. Yes, the Civil War would be about states' rights, just the nullification crisis was, but that's an incomplete sentence. States' rights to do what? And the question, and the answer is always states' rights to maintain the institution of slavery. What if the South had, what if South Carolina had not backed down? What if they said to Jackson, bring it on? They full on left the Union, raised their army. Jackson had to send troops into South Carolina. What would have happened? Would you have had a civil war right then? Would the Civil War have started in 1832? Not over slavery in any direct kind of way, but a fight over taxes. Americans had gone to war over taxes before, remember? And there's some evidence that that if the federal government, we saw this. What led to the American Revolution? Ultimately, was not taxes. It was the length that the British government were willing to go to try to subdue the colonists. Right when England militarily occupied the city of Boston, that was a bridge too far for most continentals. Right, that's when the Continental Congress formed, because of military occupation. Would military occupation of South Carolina by the federal government have triggered a sectional crisis at that point? There is some evidence that there would have been widespread support. There would have been support outside of South Carolina for supporting South Carolina. Sorry, I don't have the lecture notes anymore. I had a long quotation from a planter as far away as Louisiana. He would say, look, I'm not a nullifier, but this tax is ruinous to the South. And before I would I'm paraphrasing, before I would see South Carolina put to the sword, I would be hung for treason. So there is some evidence to suggest that if South Carolina had proceeded and the federal government had to military occupy South Carolina or Charleston or wherever, that would have triggered a kind of sectional response. That said, historians who have studied this event, what they find is, around South Carolina, there was much stronger condemnation of South Carolina than there was support for South Carolina. While Southerners in general bought into that tariff of abominations idea, most persons outside of South Carolina were not nullifiers or would not support South Carolina leaving the Union. That's what the evidence suggests. So, but again, it's one of those hypotheticals, right? Could the Civil War started in 1832? Maybe, maybe not. But certainly what the nullification crisis significance is, it shows how divided the country is. It shows how, there's so many different triggers, right? This is the tax issue that brings on this particular crisis. But in the midst of that crisis, you have people like Calhoun saying, yeah, well, this is ultimately really, it's not really about taxes, it's really about slavery. It's just all these issues kind of mingled together. But one thing that's clear, South Carolina suggests the United States has an identity crisis. There are a lot of people who say we're a union. We're a married couple that can't get divorced. But those are also a lot of people in the country who say we're a confederacy. We're a union of sovereign partners, and we can be dissolved. We can get divorced. And that issue is not being settled. It's only being heightened. Well, ultimately, the nullification crisis ends in a compromise. Again, Americans encounter a crisis, but then we compromise. Crisis, then compromise. This is a good pattern. This is how politics is supposed to work, right? You're supposed to fight for your principles, but at the end of the day, politics is the art of compromise, right? So the American system is, even in the midst of a horrific division like the nullification crisis, the American system is still doing what it's supposed to do. At the end of the day, there's supposed to be a compromise, and there is. Nevertheless, as we move on from the nullification crisis, slavery begins to move back to the forefront. It's an issue that's being forced at the grassroots. It's the abolitionists, more abolitionists arising at the South that, fearing another Nat Turner's kind of rebellion is becoming even more draconian in its control of its exploitation over its slaves, its expansion of its slave system. The country is getting more polarized over the issue of slavery as we move out from nullification. And what we begin to see in the 1830s, but particularly in the 1840s, is what will ultimately bring on the demise of our union, which is the collapse of our two-party system. Look, here's the thing about our country. We can be divided. We can be horribly divided as people, as citizens. As long as our elected officials can figure out how to get along, there's hope for union. And in 1833, there was good reason for hope. Okay, we had a two-party system in 1833, just like we have in 2021, just like we had in 1795. We've always had a two-party system. You might hate the two-party system, but it's the only one we've ever had. And that's what we have.
in 1833. We have two national parties, the Whigs, Democrats. Jackson heads up the Democrats. Whigs are headed up by whoever. They didn't have great leadership at the time. You would have encountered these names, Whigs and Democrats, in the Maclay book, so feel free to review kind of what they stood for. They divided over economic issues. Whigs, kind of going back to Henry Clay and the National Republicans and John Quincy and James Monroe from an earlier period. Whigs believed the federal government needed to take more of a lead in economic development. So Whigs believed the federal government should be like building highways and like funding public education. And Democrats believed, well, that's too much for the federal government to be doing. Roads should be left to private industry. We should not be funding schools. Could you imagine the federal government ever like building highways and funding public education? It would be a horrible country to live in, wouldn't it? Yeah. It will, these were the things Americans used to divide over. Americans used to believe federal government can't build highways, federal government can't fund public education. And then the federal government begins building highways and funding public education. And then Americans realize, oh, I guess the federal government can build highways and fund public education. There's a lot the federal government can do if it's given a chance to do it. But this is the divide here in the 1830s and 1840s between Whigs and Democrats. It's largely over economic issues. Should we have a central bank or not was a huge one that you probably encountered in the Clay chapter. Here's the important thing to know, though. This is a national party system, right? There are Whigs in the North, there are Whigs in the South. There are Whigs in the North, there are Democrats in the North, there are Democrats in the South. And they got along with each other. Northern Whigs, Southern Whigs, they crossed the Mason-Dixon line, but they had this certain economic philosophy that they were committed to. Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, they had this economic agenda too that united them. So there was hope for the country. Now, even after this horrific crisis of nullification, reality is we have a national two-party system. And as long as those parties stay national, right? As long as there's Northern and Southern Whigs, as long as there's Northern and Southern Democrats, there's hope for the country to stay together, right? We can fight across the Mason-Dixon line. The politicians have to, at the end of the day, figure out how to compromise. Something that is happening during these years, and it's ultimately the slavery question, is bringing about is the weakening of the two-party system. Ultimately, the Civil War occurred at the time the two-party system collapses, right? You will have one party in 1860 win the election, the Republican Party. You know how many Republicans there were in the South? The Republican Party is a truly sectional party. Northern Democrats stayed national. The Whig Party in the 1850s, as we'll see in Thursday's lecture, the Whig Party just completely collapsed. When that happened, when the two-party system collapsed, it became impossible for Washington to hold together. When Washington couldn't hold together anymore, splits up. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. What we need to talk about is how did this weakening of the two-party system come about? Big surprise, it was over slavery. So there's Northern Southern Whigs, there's Northern Southern Democrats. Country as well, right? Northerners and Southerners are dividing increasingly over the slavery issue. As long as our politicians can get along, right? And our politicians, they have gag rules, right? They're not even allowed to talk about slavery when they meet in Congress. And they think that somehow by not talking about slavery, things will work out. Because as you know, if you have problems with a roommate, the best thing to do is to not talk about those problems. Because eventually they'll go away, right? The problems will go away and everything will work out and everything will be fine. Because the worst thing you can do when you have a problem with someone is talk to them. Right? Isn't that what Christianity teaches us? Don't solve problems, avoid them. Yeah, all right. Going too far down the sarcastic road. Yeah, we know you've got to work through your differences, as ugly as that may be. Congress thinks they can just ignore this issue while Northerners and Southerners are increasingly wanting to debate the slavery question in Congress. As I said, the abolitionist movement is beginning to expand in the 1830s. It's not just the radical abolitionists anymore. Out of the Christian revivals, the Second Great Awakening, you have a new anti-slavery movement. The very unfortunate acronym of the American Anti-Slavery Society, or AAS. American Anti-Slavery Society is a more moderate, a more moderate anti-slavery body, right? The AASS stands for immediate abolition of slavery. It's a moral institution, right? They oppose slavery on moral grounds. However, unlike the radical abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, we talked about in the last lecture, a lot of the members of the AASS, they don't necessarily believe in racial equality. A lot of them are colonizers. Let's end slavery in the South, and then we'll put the freemen on ships and sail them back to Africa. We've already talked about the problem with colonization. There is no going back to Africa for the freemen. They're not from Africa, right? There is only staying here in North America. So the AASS, for as much as it's mainstreaming the anti-slavery position, it's pretty flawed in its answer to, well, what will come after? You know, there's not a lot of support, as you might imagine, in the South for AASS recommendations. Nevertheless, as you know, evangelicalism coming out of the Second Great Awakening continues to spread, the anti-slavery position is kind of spreading with it. Again, a more moderate one, but nevertheless an identifiable anti-slavery position. The AASS decides to take their fight. All right, AASS could have remained apolitical. They could have just tried to pressure Southerners. Hey, why don't you do what George Washington did? Why don't you do what Thomas Jefferson did? Just free your slaves, right? South Carolina, Andrew Jackson's not going to make you free your slaves. Why don't you just voluntarily? They could have stayed at an apolitical level. They don't. They ultimately form a political party. The political wing of the AASS is called the Liberty Party, a third political party. Here's the thing about third political parties. You know, the conventional wisdom is, oh, don't vote third party. That you're just throwing your vote away, right? Third political parties are actually really important throughout American history because they force changes to the two-party system. And that's what will happen with the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party is a sectional party dedicated to the eradication of slavery in North America. They will not, like most third parties, they will not elect many people to office, but the Liberty Party will be really good at putting out very divisive propaganda or very, very divisive slogans. The Liberty Party popularizes the term slave power. What is the South? South is the slave power the Liberty Party argues. Slave power wanting to pervert the federal government, wanting to take over all of North America, expand slavery throughout this continent. Even though, you know, and the whole idea of a slave power was intended to connote, intended to call it a kind of King George, a tyrannical imagery, the slave power, because Americans, North and South, realize most Americans, like overwhelmingly, did not own slaves. Only 25% of Southerners ever owned slaves. And of that 25%, only 5% ever owned more than 5 slaves. Slavery was always a minority. Slave holding, slave owning was always a minority, extreme minority experience in North America. Nevertheless, the slave owners exerted a lot of influence, or at least the Liberty Party wanted you to think that they did. So they called Southerners the slave power and an oligarchy of slave owners looking to impose their will through the federal government on all the American people. We're used to Southerners complaining about being tyrannized by the North, by the federal government. Understand throughout this time, Northerners were floating out images of being tyrannized by a Southern aristocracy of slave owners. But the language of tyranny, of oppression, floated back and forth between these two regions. The Liberty Party will not put that many people in office. Nevertheless, its language of the slave power, a very divisive imagery, floats through the two-party system. You don't have to, the Liberty Party doesn't have to put people in Congress to have an influence. What the Liberty Party needs to do is to get Northern Democrats and Northern Whigs to start using the language of the slave power. And they do. So you got Northern and Southern Whigs, but you got some Northerners who are starting to talk about the South as a slave power. How do you think that makes Southern Whigs feel? You'll be able to work together anymore? Northern Democrats start complaining about the slave power of the South. How do you think that makes Southern Democrats feel? You see what I mean? The two-party system is being weakened through the rise of these third parties. Now, the Liberty Party will only be around for a short time. Its language of the slave power will persist after its demise. The real third party that will exert the truly destructive influence on the two-party system will come in response to the Mexican-American War. Maclay has talked about this, so you can, if you want the details of this, you can review it there. Mexican-American War orchestrated to secure the southern half, the southwestern part of the United States and California from Mexico. That war was fought. It didn't last between 1846 and 1848. It just, 1846 is when everyone kind of realized, well, after Texas was annexed in 1845, that's when everyone kind of realized, all right, that land is going to be secured by the United States. We're either going to buy it from Mexico or we're going to go to war to take that land. Ultimately, Mexico will not sell it, and so we go to war to take that land. Even before that, though, I mean, everyone kind of realized that this manifest destiny. Everyone kind of realized what's happening in the 1840s. That the movement is out west and is securing the southwestern part of the United States. The northern half, the Louisiana Purchase, the transcontinental treaty, that's all secure. What about the southern half of North America? The part of North America, Canada at least. What about that? Is that going to be, once that comes into the United States, and everyone realizes it's going to come into, it's going to belong to the United States. It's our manifest destiny. We're going to get that land one way or the other. So even before we even go to war with Mexico, our politicians are already kind of asking, well, is that going to be slave or free land? Who's that land going to be belong to? There are some politicians, mainly Northern Whigs, who are saying, let's not expand out there. Let's not fight the Mexican-American War, because they realized what was going to happen. If we do secure that land, we're going to be right back to the Missouri Compromise. We're going to be right back to the fight. I mean, some politicians, including good old Henry Clay, realized we probably shouldn't do this. Manifest destiny was going to break us. Nevertheless, it's our manifest destiny. The thing that unites us is the thing that divides us. We have to secure that land out west for our future population. We have to do it. But inevitably, the question is going to arise, slave or free. Well, you say, that issue settled, right? Missouri Compromise settled that issue, 3630. So let's just, all right, right here is the 3630, just to here. Okay, this land's going to come into the United States. Let's just draw the line the rest of the way over, right? Above the line,
free, below the line slave. They could have just, settled that. Here's the thing though, how many people in Washington making these decisions were in office in 1819 when the 3630 line was established? Now I kind of get this. I would have, as a politician, I would have a hard time feeling bound by decisions that were made 10, 15, 20 years before I was in office. I would have a hard time feeling bound. And so, one politician in particular did not want to feel bound by the 3630. His name was David Wilmot. Sorry, I don't have his name on the PowerPoint slide. I have his last name, Wilmot. Hopefully you can figure out how to spell David. David Wilmot, a politician. Oh, man. I think he's from Nebraska, but I'm not. I'm not. Maybe, I don't know where. Maybe Ohio. I don't know. He's like from the Midwest. I forget where. So McClay can answer that for you. But Wilmot kind of sees where all this is heading. Before we're even in war with Mexico, he puts out his proviso, essentially a statement saying, look, any land that comes into the United States as a result of a land purchase or a war with Mexico shall be free sold. Any land coming into the United States as a result of a war or land purchase with Mexico shall be free sold. What has Wilmot just done in his proviso, or what is he suggesting in his proviso? He just put a bomb on top of the Missouri Compromise. He just blew it up. Forget the 3630. All of the land out west, all of it should be free sold. All of it should reflect the vision of the North that I talked about in the last lecture. A vision of white sons and daughters being able to move out west without the interference of slave plantations or even free persons of color. It was an intensely racist vision of expansion. And Wilmot says it should be not just the vision of America above 3630, it should be the vision of the entire western, north and south, western parts of the United States. All of it should be free. Wilmot has effectively blown up the Missouri Compromise, and it will never be put back together. Yeah, there'll be people saying, let's just extend the line, let's maintain the compromise, but it goes nowhere. Wilmot's proviso becomes a new rallying force in Congress, but a very sectional rallying force, right? Southerners are not gravitating, obviously, to Wilmot's proviso, but Northern politicians are. Northerners are. AASS members, radical abolitionists are. And ultimately, in 1847, around Wilmot's proviso to help crystallize, to support, to try to ensure Wilmot's proviso becomes federal policy, they form a new political party, the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party. Again, like the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party is a sectional third party. There are no Southern Free Soilers. Okay, this is a northern-based party pushing a northern vision of the West, and a radical one, right? One in which they are not willing to share with Southern slave owners 1 inch of Western territory, new Western territory, which then is a result of that. Their slogan: free soil, free labor, free speech, free men. Free soil,
meaning soil free of slavery, will result in free labor. A person cannot remain economically independent. A person cannot hope to be a self-sustaining farmer, an entrepreneur, a businessman, a self-starting gold miner in California. Right? A person can't be free, economically free, if they have to compete with slave labor. It just can't happen. And so free soil, free from slavery, will result in free labor, providing not just prosperity, but providing freedom. It's hard for Americans to understand this because over the course of the late 19th and 20th century, we became a predominantly wage-based economy. Right? We work for other people. We are not economically dependent. As long as we get paid a decent wage, we don't really complain much. We don't care nearly as much about economic freedom as this generation. Not many Americans today are willing to sacrifice a paycheck in order to have some, more control over their life. I should say I'm somebody who did. I knew I wouldn't make a lot of money. I could make a lot more money doing something else than going into higher education. But I would have to work hours that other people told me to work. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have as much control over my daily life as I could. Higher education is one of those places where we keep that myth of economic independence alive. So I get the free labor argument of this time, right? I get that you don't want to be dependent. People didn't want it. It wasn't just that they wanted a chance to become rich; it was that they wanted to be free. They wanted to be not just politically free, but they wanted to be economically free too. And they thought they could not do that as long as they had to compete with slave labor. So free soil would maintain a tradition dating back to the American Revolution, of free labor. If we could combine free soil with free speech, right? Where does free speech come from? This has to do with debating slavery in Congress, right? We have to be able to debate slavery at a congressional level, right? So we need free speech, free soil, free labor, free soil, free labor, free speech will result ultimately in free men. How does the American Revolution continue to produce free men? Only as we restrict the expansion of slavery to its present bound. This is what the Wilmot Proviso ultimately proposed. Understand, Wilmot was not calling for, he was not an abolitionist. He was not a member of the ASS or radical abolitionist. He was not calling for the abolition of slavery. Most free soilers, most free soilers, however, were not calling for the abolition of slavery. They were calling for the restriction of slavery. They were fine with slavery in its existing bounds. As one free soil editor put it this way, the question is not whether black men will be made free, but whether white men will remain free. Most free soilers did not care about the plight of enslaved persons. They cared about the future of the white population of the United States, and they believed that the white population of the United States would only be able to maintain their Republican freedoms, smaller Republican freedoms, if slavery was restricted to its existing bounds. Right? This is, after all, the white man's republic. Right? And this is about how is white male power to be maintained in the United States only as slavery is restricted. That is the basis of the Free Soil Party and the Free Soil argument. Free Soilers will not put that many people in office. They'll put more people in than the Liberty Party did. They will actually run a presidential slate at one point.
They won't win. So they'll win a few seats in Congress, but that's not their importance, right? The question with the question always with third political parties is not, are you putting your people in office? The question with third political parties is your ideology, is your program, is it getting enacted by the two-party system, right? The Green Party. No one cares if the Green Party, no one cares who the Green Party candidate for president is because they had no chance of winning. No one cares about that. What we do care about is, are Republicans or Democrats listening to the Green Party? Are they trying to enact what the Green Party is standing for? Well, at this time, the question is not, are the Free Soilers putting their people in office? They weren't. But the question was, were Northern Whigs and Democrats listening to David Wilmot? Were they listening to the free soil, free labor, free speech, free man ideology? The answer is yes. More so than the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, during its short run between 1847 and 1854, will restructure or begin to restructure the two-party system. I mean, who made up the Free Soilers? It's Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats. But even Northern Democrats and Northern Whigs who chose to stay in those parties still began to talk the language of free soil, free speech, free labor, free men. Just like the slave power imagery and the slave power slogan was popular, so was the free soil, free labor, free speech, free men ideology and catchphrase. Here's how popular it was. I will talk more about this party on Thursday's lecture, but the Free Soil Party was shut down in 1854. So it's a short-lived party, a lot of third parties. But a new party arose in 1854 that you might have heard of. You probably had never heard of the Free Soil Party before today's lecture. You might have heard of the Republican Party. Yeah? Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump. Yeah, that one. Yeah, no. Yeah. The Republican Party will start in 1854. By the way, where did the Republican Party start? Jackson, Michigan. You can go to Franklin and 2nd Street now. There's people in Wisconsin, and the Republicans will say, no, it's in Wisconsin. No, they're wrong. It's in Jackson, Michigan. You can go to the corner of Franklin and 2nd Street. There's a little bench and a little plaque there. That's where the first Republican Party went. Right? We own that. Little different Republican Party than the party of Reagan and Trump. But they will start in 1854. Guess what the first slogan of the Republican Party was? Anyone want to guess? Anyone want to guess what the first slogan of the Republican Party was? Purely sectional party that will put their candidate in office in 1868 or anything. What their first slogan was? Begins with the word free. Yeah, the Free Soil Party shuts down, but the Republican Party, which will be much more successful in messing up the two-party system, adopts as its slogan, free soil, free labor, free speech. Free. So understand the importance of third political parties in our history. They can, in some ways, sometimes third political parties, and more often than not, third political parties maintain the two-party system. That's their function. But in this particular point in our history, the third political parties weaken the two parties. So 1847, after Wilmot's proviso blows up the Missouri Compromise, we're fighting a war in the southwestern part of North America against Mexico. We're fighting a different kind of war in Washington. Trying to pick up the pieces after in the blast zone that is Wilmot's proviso what's the map forward now? What we could count on the Missouri Compromise line before. What's the new line, right? So 1847, 1850 is another one of those times that is just, you think you live through, a great, you think politics today is unbearable or unwatchable. Thank God there wasn't TV in 1847 or 1850, so you could know even more of what was going on behind the scenes. This is a terrible time. So we go with Wilmot, not with Wilmot. Do we draw a new line? What do we do? I mean, it's just a complete time of mess and chaos in our political system. We've been here before. We've compromised. That's what we do in 1850. We compromise again. Yeah, for at least the third time in our young history. The Compromise of 1850, settling the crisis unleashed by Wilmot's proviso by the Free Soil Party. Compromise of 1850 is going to settle this issue. You can use Maclay's book to kind of get the details on this. There's different parts to it. California has made California will come into the Union as a free state. Something about slavery. I think the slave trade is banned in Washington, D.C. The southern half of the southwestern part of the United States is going to be determined at a later time by popular sovereignty. I'll talk more about that next week. And we'll have a stronger national fugitive slave law. I'll talk more about that next week as well, too. Here's where I want to kind of end, well, a couple things. If there's ever an argument for continuing to vote the same politician into office again and again and again, it's called the incumbency effect. If there's ever an argument for that being a good thing, Henry Clay would be the face of the incumbency effect. Remember Henry Clay? He was the guy who figured out the Missouri Compromise back in 1819. Somebody dusted off Henry Clay. He's still there. The dude's still there in 1849. And somebody dusts him off and says, Clay, can you bail us out again? He's like, yeah, I got one more in me. So he actually orchestrates the Compromise of 1850. It's the same guy. And we're talking about one person being able to make a difference in history. Henry Clay is one of those. The Compromise of 1850 has worked out. I'll end on this point. We've seen this before. The very thing that unites us divides us. The Compromise of 1850 was intended to bring the country together, unite North and South. Now over the question of the expansion of slavery. The expansion of slavery had triggered yet another national crisis, just like it had done in 1819. We compromised. The 1850s are looking pretty good. To begin with a big political compromise seems to settle the slavery issue. The 1850s are looking pretty good. In fact, it's the very provisions of the Compromise of 1850 which will make things so much worse. We'll begin exploring this on Thursday. It's the Compromise of 1850, the thing that brings us together, settles theoretically the slave expansion question. It's the very parts of the Compromise of 1850 which will make us even all the more divided in the 1850s. And what we'll see is again and again and again, Americans appear to be rehearsing or reenacting the American Revolution. As one side will claim the side of unity and the other side will claim the side of liberty, or each side will claim liberty against the tyranny of the other section. It appears that nothing less in the 1850s, that all the different fights that we will talk about on Thursday, all these different conflicts ultimately came back to
which section best represented or best understood the American Revolution, which section best incorporated the values and the concerns of the American Revolution. And this identity crisis will be worked out throughout the 1850s. And it will end. Look, the 1850s are they're the worst decade in our history. And probably 1,000 years from now, the 1850s will probably still be the worst decade in our history. A decade that ends in civil war, a decade that ends in 700,000 people dead, that's a bad decade. That you had a bad day. You had a bad decade, okay? When your decade ends in civil war, it's bad. And for all of the efforts to try to pave over our differences, the 1850s just looks like a train wreck you can't avoid. I want to kind of leave you with a visual representation of what it was like being American, or an audible representation of what it was like being American in the 1850s. So I need you to help me reenact the 1850s. All right? So you guys over here, you're my Southerners. All right. So I need you to keep one eye on me. So when I point to you, I want you to turn to them and say, "You're tyrannizing." All right. When I point to you, you're going to look at them and you say, "You're tyrannizing." They're my Yankees. When I point to you, you look at them and say, "No, you're tyrannizing us." Okay. Everyone got their roles? You're tyrannizing us. No, you're tyrannizing us. Okay. So watch for when I point to you. That's when you're going to say that to the other side. All right. We ready? Okay.
No, you're tyrannizing us.
That is the 1850s. It's one crisis after another that does not end in a compromise until secession and civil war. See y'all Thursday.
You guys take care.